All right, so this is a continuation of the lecture discussion that we started on the 10th, and which I was hoping to finish on the 12th. And so instead, you have an audio version, and hopefully, the notes, while it didn't for the other class, show up on the screen. Hopefully, it will record with the outline in front of us so you can follow along. Your 3-page handout of the French Revolution, extensive as it is, should have sufficed. But since we did go into a detailed discussion of the Industrial Revolution, I'm going to do the same with the French. And we started with the underlying causes of the French Revolution. And then we're about to launch into the immediate causes with different historical interpretations about the start of the French Revolution once the immediate causes had been analyzed. So, like all other societies in Europe at that point in time in the 18th century, the French society was grounded in inequality. We describe the French society as the old regime or the Ancien regime. The Ancien regime is not missing a T, just like the philosophes in the Enlightenment were not missing an R. It's just a fancy French way of saying ancient or the old regime. We're looking at a population of approximately 27 million, divided as it had always been since the Middle Ages into 3 estates or 3 orders. The first estate or the first order consisted of the clergy, approximately about 130,000 people who owned approximately 10% of the land. And they were exempt from taxation, tile, although the church agreed to pay a voluntary contribution every 5 years to the state. They were clearly not required to, and oftentimes did not make that contribution. The clergy was radically divided because there was a great deal of difference, as we talked about briefly, between the higher clergy, stemming from aristocratic families, the second and third brothers we talked about in connection with the law of primogeniture or the eldest son inheriting property. And they shared a fair amount of empathy and interest with the nobility, while the parish priests, often poor and from the class of the common people in the third estate, had a lot more in common with the ordinary folk, below the nobility, below the clergy, below the bourgeoisie. So, speaking of the nobility, the second estate, the nobility was composed of were anywhere between 120,000 to 350,000 people. We are looking at fluctuating figures because oftentimes, depending on who is keeping track of the records, they're going to announce some people as belonging to the nobility and some they would not acknowledge as part of the nobility. We're looking at 120,000 to 350,000 in membership, again, depending on who is credited with the status of a noble. And this particular group owned about 25 to 30% of the land. Under Louis XV and Louis XVI, the nobility continued to play an important role, even a crucial role in French society, holding many of the leading positions in the government, the military, the law courts, the higher clerical offices. A lot of the heavy industry that started in France, albeit later than in England, that was controlled by the nobility, either through investment or through ownership, particularly of mining and metallurgical enterprises. French nobility also included what was known as the nobility of the robe, and that was people of equal rank and wealth, but they were actually graduating to the status of nobility. And these were people who dressed like the nobility, unlike the pure blue blood aristocracy, the nobility of the sword. The nobility of the robe tended to dominate the law courts and some of the administrative offices. The nobility of the sword claimed to be the descendants of the original medieval nobility, and both sought to expand power at the expense of the monarchy, to defend liberty by resisting arbitrary action of the monarchs, and to maintain their monopoly control over positions in the military, in the church, and the government. In the early 1780s, in reaction to the ambitions of the aristocrats, uh, newly arrived from the old bourgeoisie, a law was passed to limit the sale of military officerships to only fourth generation nobility. And that excluded a lot of the newly entered members of the nobility, particularly the nobility of the Rove. Although there were many poor nobles as such, particularly since the agrarian wealth was declining and a lot of the peasants had deserted the rural areas in favor of new urban relocation. The fortunes of some of the wealthy aristocrats remained the same, and oftentimes they competed with the wealth of the monarchy because there were similarly established aristocratic families. But by and large, a lot of the nobility tended to borrow a lot more money to maintain the lifestyles of the rich and famous. And so oftentimes they would be really forced to make collaborative alliances with the bourgeoisie. In general, they were a fairly close group, only the more desperate allowing themselves to make marriage alliances or take loans from the up and coming bourgeoisie who dressed like the nobility and become a part of the nobility of the robe over time. So while the privileges varied from region to region, the very possession of privileges remained a hallmark of the Second Estate, and common to the First and the Second Estate were the tax exemptions, especially the tille, T-A-I-L-L-E. The Third Estate, they were commoners in society. It's an overwhelming number, the large majority of the French population, who differed widely from one another in terms of wealth and occupation and level of education. Peasants alone constituted about 75 to 80% of the total population, and they were by far the largest segment of the Third Estate. The richer of the peasants actually owned about 35 to 40% of the land, although their holdings varied from area to area. Over half had little to no land and would survive since serfdom was no longer officially in place. They survived with limited allowances in the estates, on the outskirts of the estates of their old aristocratic masters. The French peasants still had obligations to these local landlords, and they were the relics of the old feudal society, surviving from a much earlier age. And although technically they could not be enforced, the peasants were expected to abide by these. Sort of a courtesy to the aristocratic structure and another testimony to the existence of the Ancien regime. These obligations included a payment of fees for the use of village facilities like the flour mill or the community oven. Sometimes they would really have to pay contributions to the son of the aristocrats, the son's wedding, or the daughter's wedding, or the son's graduation. The nobility also maintained the right to hunt on the peasants' land, and while the peasants resented these obligations, as well as the attempt of the noble landowners in the 18th century to enclose open fields, there really was not much they could do about it except grumble until on the eve of the French Revolution. Another part of the Third Estate consisted of skilled craftsmen, also shopkeepers and wage earners in the cities. The 18th century was a period of rapid urban growth, and 90% of towns really had fewer than 10,000 inhabitants. So the rise in population, the growth of towns was an ongoing feature, And together with this came a rise in consumer prices, um, which was far greater than the increase in wages. And so in Paris, for example, the income lagged behind food prices, especially 140% rise in rents for the working people in skilled and unskilled trades. About 2.3 million were the bourgeoisie or the middle class who owned about 20 to 25% of the land. Included in this group were also the merchants and bankers who who contributed a great deal to the state treasury. In fact, from trade and manufacturing, a fair amount of taxes would go to the state treasury, and that is how they would be accepted by the administration. Even though some of the nobility of the sword, as we talked about the last time, resented the up and coming nouveau riche, the monarchy, from the time of the new monarchy to French absolutists, they found in the bourgeoisie a counterpoise against the old aristocratic rivals. The bourgeoisie also included professional people, lawyers, holders of public office, writers, professors. Many members of the bourgeoisie sought security of status in the purchase of land, and they had their own set of grievances because often they were excluded from social and political privileges or acceptance by the nobility. So a lot of resentment that accumulated within the richest members of the Third Estate as they're aspiring to becoming the nobility and emulating the lifestyles of the rich and famous, the non-acceptance rankled, and they would oftentimes not be in empathy with the nobility. It was not simply a case of a unified bourgeois resistance or a unified nobility against the other classes. In fact, that was the old interpretation of the French Revolution. The First and the Second Estate as an ally grouped against the Third Estate. But it was never as black and white as all that. No group was really monolithic. The poor parish priest had a lot of sympathy, for the poor peasant. Members of the nobility could go either way, having empathy for the bourgeoisie or looking down their noses at every other class except the nobility. So the combinations could work in a number of ways. It was possible for wealthy middle-class individuals to enter the ranks of the nobility, like I said, by attaining public office or by entering the category of the nobility of the robe or through marriage. And so between about 1774 and 1789, about 2,500 of the wealthy bourgeoisie entered the nobility. The aristocracy was also participating in capitalist activities. And so on a lot of the landed estates, mining and metallurgical exploits would go on, glass making, for example, investing in foreign trade. And while some of the true blue blood looked down their nose on these money-making functions, a lot of the members actually considered that this was not just a way of the times, but a way of survival. A lot of the Enlightenment ideas proved attractive to both the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, and members of both groups shared a common outlook of liberal politics, of political thought that was different from the old view of the aristocracy, that they were technically irreplaceable as the leaders of any society. So, as we see, there are so many gray areas in all these estates. The old view the French Revolution as one of conflict between two fairly rigid orders, the first and the second, versus the third. That's not going to hold up as a strong argument. The aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, even though they're accused of having a new socioeconomic reality based on wealth and achievement, they were bound increasingly by a common frustration against the monarchy. But then that common frustration would seep into the third order as well. And so if there was one unifying factor amongst all these classes, it was that they all thought that the monarchy was inept. And the opposition to the old order, which would ultimately lead to the replacement of a monarchy by another political system, if there's anything that all three estates held in common, it was by and large a common antagonism towards the monarchy. Now, with regard to the monarchy, the other main factor in our underlying causes section of the outline, although France was home of the Enlightenment, French monarchy seemed to be singularly unaffected by the philosophy of the French intellectuals. And the monarchy clearly resisted all attempts at reform. Louis XIV had left France with enlarged territories, but an enormous debt, a very unhappy population, and a 5-year-old great-grandson as the successor. The governing of France fell into the hands of first the regent, the Duke of Orleans, who had good intentions, which were undermined by his perennial state of drunkenness and quite consistently immoral behavior. And later, the regency of Cardinal Fleury, the king's minister, and France remained largely at peace, and as trade and commerce doubled and industrialization was promoted. Even the budget was balanced for a year, around about the time that Louis XV was in command. Louis XV, however, like his predecessor, decided to rule on his own. His secrecy, his deviousness, his spendthrift ways, and his clear, obvious boredom with government and governing, and a willingness to allow his mistress, Madame Pompadour, to influence the affairs of state, undermined the monarchy's prestige even more. In effect, the 7 Years' War, for example, which led to the loss of an empire, we're talking about the North American one, also accompanied by a loss of territory in South Asia, in India. That was accompanied by heavy taxation. The burden of taxation was borne by the French because of a mounting public debt, and court life, at the same time, remained extravagant and frivolous and carefree. And Louis XV failed to realize not only the extent of the financial problems that France was encountering, but also the extent of aggravation and disgust that his monarchy invoked in the people. Things will last my lifetime at any rate, was his myopic remark, and clearly his short-sightedness led to the downfall of the Bourbons. Perhaps even then, all might not have been in vain if Louis had been succeeded by a competent king. But the new king, the 19-year-old grandson who became Louis XVI, ruling from 1774 to 1792, his predecessor ruled from 1715 to 1774, these are all long reigns, mind you. Louis XVI was obese, he was lethargic, unable to stay awake in government during government business, fairly unsure of himself, and allowed himself to be swayed by shallow inconsistent, unreasonable advisors, as also by Marie Antoinette at times. Neither was able to fathom the depths of despair and discontent that the nation had sunk to, which would ultimately promote the revolution. So while the long-range causes of the French Revolution can be found in the growing frustration, the growing inequalities, the growing inability of the monarchy to deal with anything that the country was experiencing, and the new social realities and problems, other factors were also present. The failure of the French monarchy was exacerbated by specific problems in the 1780s. Periodic crises included bad harvests, 1787 and 88, food shortage, manufacturing world was not keeping up with what was happening in England, trying to play catch up with England and Belgium and the Dutch Republic, rising prices from food, unemployment was about 33%. Things were reaching crisis proportions around the time that you would associate with the eve of the French Revolution, 1787-88. The existing privileges of the aristocracy was even more galling. Philosophers were aware of these existing differences, aware of the untenable situation the monarchy posed, aware that the tax exemptions could not last, but they never quite advocated revolution. There were revolutionary ideas, the ideas of equality and liberty, but not quite to the point where the nobility, the elite, was eliminated. Historians have debated the importance of these ideas, the ideas of the philosophers, but there is no doubt that they never went to the ultimate logical culmination, which was a revolutionary restructuring of French society. In fact, people like Voltaire would often argue that the people were like sheep. They were goaded by hay. They were like oxen or sheep. There were several comparisons he made, all of which included the bovine variety. And so there was really no confidence in the people's ability to lead the country out of the depths of despair. Now, if you turn to the immediate causes of the French Revolution, this was the near collapse of the government financial situation. The government expenditure had continued to grow because of costly wars and royal extravagance, and the government responded by borrowing at an exorbitantly high rate of interest. The king's finance ministry wrestled with the problem, but met with resistance in terms of how they would tax the people who were on the verge of complete financial collapse anyway. And eventually, the government, after much hesitation, finally forced to call a meeting of the Estates General, the French Parliament, a body which had not met since 1614. So a good 175 years later, while the Estates General met, the government was virtually admitting that the Crown could not govern without the assistance of a financial institution, without the assistance of a responsible assembly, which would take care of the declining finances of the nation. The Estates General consisted of representatives from the three orders in French society. In the elections for the Estates General, the government had ruled that the Third Estate should get double representation, since it constituted 97% of the population. And while both the First Estate, the clergy, and the Second Estate, the nobility, had about 300 delegates, from before that was a tradition, 175 years ago that was a tradition, the commoners had 600 representatives, with a lot of legal and urban representation. From the Second Estate, 1/3 were the liberal kind, urban-oriented, interested in ideas of the Enlightenment. About half of them were under 40. So the activities of the Third and the Second Estate had some common ties with their youth, with their urban background, with their hostility to privilege, with sort of a forward-looking attitude. The Estates General opened at Versailles on the 5th of May 1789, and some argue that this was the start of the French Revolution. It was an open admission that the monarchy, the absolutist monarchy, had failed and divine right had not come to their rescue. It was troubled about whether voting should be by order or by head, one vote per person or one vote per estate. The Parliament of Paris consisted of the nobility of the robe, who advocated voting by order, according to the form that was used in 1614. Each order could vote separately, and each would have veto power over the other two, thus guaranteeing an aristocratic control over any reform attempt. But the Third Estate remained adamant about voting by head or per person, since it had doubled the representation. With the assistance of a few liberal members of the nobility and clerics, it was guaranteed to win, and would advocate turning three estates into a single chamber, a unilateral unichamber legislature that would reform France in its own way, but at a steady pace. One representative, Abbe Sieyes, Sieyes, issued a pamphlet which he called "What is the Third Estate?" And here he poses the question, he actually presents the answer himself. What is the Third Estate? It is everything. What has it been thus far in the political order? Nothing. What does it demand? To become something. And Sieyes was looking ahead. As yet, in 1789, most delegates still desired to make changes within a framework of respect for authority of kings and monarchs, that is. A revival or reform didn't mean a complete overthrow of traditional institutions. When the First Estate declared in favor of voting by order, the Third Estate felt compelled to respond in a significant fashion. And so on June 17, 1789, the Third Estate voted to constitute itself a National Assembly and decided to draw up a constitution. And often this declaration on June 17th is seen as the first step in the French Revolution, some historians would argue. Since the Third Estate had no legal right to act as a National Assembly, this was a revolutionary action, largely the work of lawyers belonging to the Third Estate, but it was soon in jeopardy because the king sided with the First Estate and threatened to dissolve the Estates General. Louis XVI, now prepared to use force, actually wanted to end the revolution of the lawyers, and it seemed like their action was in imminent danger of being doomed. The intervention of the common people, however, in a series of urban and rural uprisings in July and August 1789, saved the Third Estate from the king's attempted counter-revolution. The most famous urban uprising was the fall of the Bastille, which is often seen by historians as the real start of the French Revolution. So you've already had two different starts. Here is a third possible start of the French Revolution. The king's attempt to take defensive measures by increasing the number of troops to secure arsenals in Paris and guard the roads to Versailles served not to intimidate, but rather to inflame public opinion. The increased mob activities in Paris led to Parisian leaders to form a permanent committee and keep order, but they needed arms and ammunition. And so they organized a popular force to capture the Invalides, a royal armory. And on July 14, they attacked the Bastille, which was another royal armory. Now, the Bastille was a prison. It was a state symbol of power, of arbitrary power, a state prison. But it was not taken over because it was a prison, since it contained only 7 prisoners. Its fall was a reminder to the people that they had indeed triumphed over despotism, over the absolutist system. Paris was abandoned to the insurgents, and Louis XVI soon informed that the royal troops were unreliable, um, he seemed to have accepted that reality and signaled the collapse of the Austria regime just by his inaction. Louis clearly could not enforce his will. The king then confirmed the appointment of the Marquis de Lafayette as commander of the newly created citizens' militia, um, and this was known as the National Guard. And some would argue that that admission itself, that the people actually had their own people's militia, was the start of the French Revolution. Or the fall of the Bastille, which saved the National Assembly and was a symbol of the downfall of absolutist power. Some would argue that is a more tangible start of the French Revolution. Popular revolutions then became numerous, particularly in the cities, but also in the rural areas. There were empathetic riots, particularly because there was growing resentment against the feudal-like obligations, the seigneurial system and obligations that remained, that we talked about, where even though they were technically no longer serfs, they had obligations to their old aristocratic overlords class. This was greatly exacerbated by economic and fiscal activities of the great stateholders, the nobility or the richer of the bourgeoisie in the 1780s, and they created the conditions ripe for a popular uprising. The fall of the Bastille and the king's apparent capitulation, the demands, made the Third Estate believe that they had power in their hands and that they could continue to take more power. So at the end of July to the beginning of August, the peasant rebellions increased in number. There were in 5 major areas of France, and while the patterns varied, in some places peasants simply forced their lay and ecclesiastical lords to renounce their dues. Elsewhere they burned charters listing their obligations. The peasants were not acting in blind fury. They were not attacking individuals, such as members of the aristocracy, but they were attacking the symbols of inequality, the charters, the provisions that continue to treat them as inferior citizens. And so the agrarian revolt served as a backdrop to what would be known as the Great Fear, a vast panic which spread like wildfire through France between mid-July and early August. A fear of invasion by the French troops, aided by a supposed aristocratic plot, which encouraged the formation of more citizens' militia and permanent committees. The greatest impact of the agrarian revolt and the Great Fear on the National Assembly meeting in Versailles was to examine more attempts to reform France. Now, all of this is slowly amounting to the eventual destruction of the old regime. One of the first acts of the National Assembly, now they're called the Constituent Assembly, was to destroy relics of feudalism and old aristocratic privileges. To some dynasties, this was necessary to calm the peasants and to restore order in the countryside. But in a lot of neighboring countries, they were fearful that similar outbreaks might occur. On the night of August 4th, 1789, the National Assembly, in an astonishing session, voted to abolish seigneurial rights as well as fiscal privileges of the nobility, the clergy, some of the high officials in the towns and provinces. And within a couple of days, on August 26th, the Assembly provided the ideological foundation for its actions in a sort of document that became like an educational device. Let's see if I can get this down any further. There you go. We are still in the moderate phase of the French Revolution. It'll soon turn radical. And before it does, there's a radical document that emerges, which is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. So this is a charter of basic liberties, which rejected the ideas of the major philosophers of the French Enlightenment, which reflected, the ideas of the major philosophers of the French Enlightenment, and also owed much to the American Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration became a ringing affirmation of all that the Ancien regime was not representing. It's a vote for a support for the natural and imprescriptible rights of man, as they called it, to liberty, to property, to security, and resistance to oppression. It went on to affirm the destruction of aristocratic privileges by proclaiming an end to exemptions from taxation, the championing of freedom and equal rights of men. It was immediately followed by the Declaration of the Rights of the Woman. And access to public office was going to be now based on talent. The monarchy was restricted, and all citizens could have the right to take part in the legislative process. Freedom of speech and press was going to be honored, coupled with the outlawing of arbitrary arrests. In the meantime, Louis XVI had remained inactive at Versailles. He did refuse, however, to promulgate decrees on the abolition of seigneurial rights and to authenticate the Declaration of Rights. But the question of how much power the king had and whether or not his authentication, his granting of legitimacy was even required was something that the assemblies debated about. Early in October, on October 5th, in fact, Parisian crowd, initiated by 7,000 women, marched to the palace. They were actually going to be championed also by Lafayette and the National Guards. They marched to Versailles and forced the king to accept the constitutional and the decrees of change, and literally pressured him to change his residence to Paris so that he could be in the hub of action. And some historians would argue that this is where the French Revolution started. It's not going to be the first or the last action by a Parisian crowd that would affect national politics. The king was virtually a prisoner in Paris, under house arrest, as it were, in the National Assembly, championed by women, by the ordinary folk, with the people's militia, the women, in fact, marching with anything and everything they could get their hands on, kitchen utensils, brooms, just plain sticks. They were marching in unison with the National Guard and the rest of the people who were so frustrated with the regime and the inability of the king to take any action that they wanted the king, the queen, and the ultimate heir to the throne, the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's son, as they call them, to come to where the action was and to see for themselves that the nation really needed bread, just as a euphemism for food in general, and that the baker could not provide it. So now that the king was a virtual prisoner in Paris, the National Assembly, let me see if I can go further in the handout here. Or maybe not quite yet. Let me see if I can move up a little more, because we didn't do the civil constitution of the clergy, did we? So he's in house arrest. Virtually a prisoner, National Assembly now turns its attention to the church. The Catholic Church was viewed as an important pillar of the old order, the Ancien regime. Most of the land that it owned was taken over by the revolutionaries, and against this newly confiscated land, new currency notes were issued, known as the assignat, ASSIGNAT, in your handout under Roman numeral 7, which I see has been typed up twice. So we'll make the virtual house arrest of Louis XVI 7, and the civil constitution of the clergy 7A for now. And so under 7A, as new currency notes are issued, it's a form of paper money that is issued against the new collateral, which is the newly confiscated, now nationalized church property. July 1790, a new civil constitution of the clergy was put into effect. Bishops and priests were now to be elected by the people and paid by the state, like any other official. The Pope prohibited such an action. Majority of the bishops actually refused to take part, but a lot of the parish priests took the oath. It was an important step because the Catholic Church was a significant institution in the life of the French people and in propping up the old regime. However, this is often viewed as a tactical blunder on the part of the National Assembly, for it gave much room for debate, and the counter-revolution is popular base for adding on support and acting against the French Revolution. So this would be one of the many divisive points in the French Revolution that we will explore. By 1791, the National Assembly completed a constitution for the nation, a final draft, which established limited constitutional monarchy, somewhat along the lines of England. There was still a monarchy, but the title was different. He was a king of the French rather than the king of France, which signified that the people had something to do about it, and that he was not the owner of all property in France. But he enjoyed fewer powers. It was going to be subject to review by the Legislative Assembly. Legislative Assembly was to sit for 2 years, consist of 745 representatives chosen by an indirect system of election, which preserved power in the hands of the more affluent members of society. The National Assembly, also called the Legislative Assembly, undertook an administrative restructuring of France. It abolished all the old local and provincial divisions and divided France up into 83 départements, or departments as they called it, roughly equal in size and population. And in turn, these departments were divided into districts, which were further subdivided into communes, and they were all supervised by elected councils and officials, which foresaw finance, administration, justice, and ecclesiastical institutions within their own domains. Although both bourgeois and aristocratic elements were eligible for office based on property qualifications, a few nobles also ended up being elected, leaving local and departmental governments in the hands of the richer elements, specifically lawyers amongst the bourgeoisie. There were also uniform weights and measures introduced, the metric system, a lot of monopolies and guilds, which were barriers to trade within France, were abolished. So definitely some changes towards a more liberal, more progressive society, but by no means all was accomplished yet. By 1791, France had moved into a revolutionary reordering of the old regime, which had been achieved by a revolutionary consensus, which was largely the work of the wealthier bourgeoisie. the consensus was not a total approval rate, because you're going to find that there is going to be opposition. There's growing opposition by about 1791 from clerics, of course, from those who were against the civil constitution of the clergy, by the lower classes who seemed to be hurt by the richest elements of the third estate behaving very much like their counterparts in the nobility, by a lot of the peasants who were opposed to dues that were not totally abolished, and mainly by political clubs which seemed to go in a more radical direction and thought that the solutions for France's reordering of society were very mild and didn't quite meet the demands or expectations of the revolutionaries. The most famous of these were the Jacobin clubs, which emerged as radical groups, seem to have taken the role of leadership. So now we enter phase B, the radical phase. The Jacobin clubs seem to represent the younger, the more violently oriented, the more youthful, radical members of society. They were largely in Paris at first, and then they moved to the provinces as well. And they primarily extended their activities by maintaining a close network with affiliations to the Parisian headquarters, the Paris Club. And within about a year, between 1790 and 91, there were about 900 of these Jacobin clubs. And they were members who had tradesmen and artisans, a lot of the urban elite, very vocal, very outspoken, and looked for a drastic restructuring of French society. The government was still facing severe financial difficulties. Now there was massive tax evasion to boot. Bourgeois politicians still did not discard the king, but they had no trust in him, or in fact in their own class and the bourgeoisie. Meanwhile, the king was making plans to flee, and in June 1791, the king almost succeeded, but was caught at the border, recognized and brought back to Paris. And of course, at that point in time, he was none other than a traitor, somebody who was going to flee the country at the time of need. Radicals wanted the king to be deposed. Members of the National Assembly, fearful of popular forces in Paris, calling for I guess, a republic, which would be too drastic, chose to ignore the king's flight and pretended he'd been kidnapped. In this unsettled situation, the Legislative Assembly met for the last time in October 1791. Met for the first time in 1791. The composition of the Legislative Assembly tended to be different from that of the National Assembly from before. Clerics and nobles were now gone. Mostly the representatives were men of property, yes, but lawyers, although lacking in national reputation, most had gained experience in the last few years and were prominent speakers. They were supported by the National Guards, the Jacobin clubs. A lot of the elective offices were spawned by the administrative restructuring. And so much is reorganized within the administration. Over a period of time, European countries became concerned about the French system. Already there was a concern during the time of the Great Fear amongst aristocrats and monarchs, the fear that the revolution would spread through their countries. And so in August 1791, 27th August as a matter of fact, Emperor Leopold of Austria and Frederick William II of Prussia issued what was known as the Declaration of Pillnitz. And you see the Declaration of Pillnitz under 12 in your handout. As you see, we've been following along systematically the extensive handout, the outline. The Declaration of Pillnitz, which invited European monarchs to a strategic declaration of support. The Legislative Assembly concluded that this was a conspiracy and declared war on Austria and on Prussia too, because both the Eastern European rulers were involved. It was really a question of what the declaration meant. Now, the Declaration of Pillnitz was an empathetic declaration of support. The people's reaction to it, however, was an actual declaration of war, which meant that practically everyone in France would be involved in this war as a people's war. The reactionaries hoped that the preoccupation with war would cool off the revolution. French defeat seemed likely in view of the army's disintegration, the lack of preparation, which might even lead to the restoration of the old regime intact, hoped the reactionaries. The leftists, the more radicals, hoped that the war would consolidate the revolution at home and spread it to all European countries, thereby making the revolutionary slogan a slogan for all people, the French Revolutionary slogan, for all people. France actually fared very badly in the initial fighting, and there were loud recriminations heard in Paris. There was a frantic look for a scapegoat, who to be blamed. The king, as usual, one observer noted, everywhere you hear the cry that the king was betraying us, generals were betraying us, that nobody was to be trusted, that Paris will soon be taken over in 6 weeks by Austria. We are on a volcano ready to erupt, ready to spout flames. Defeat in war, coupled with economic shortfalls in the spring, reinvigorated people groups or popular groups who had been dormant since the previous summer and led to renewed political demonstrations in the streets, especially against the king. Radical Parisian political groups declared themselves as insurrectionary forces, as communes, and organized mob attacks, some in the royal palace of the Tuileries, on the Legislative Assembly. On August 10th in 1792, the king was taken captive. They forced the Legislative Assembly to suspend monarchy and call for a national convention, yet another name for the French Parliament. So the National Convention now was going to be chosen on the basis of universal male suffrage to decide on a future form of government, and the French Revolution had entered a truly radical phase. The Paris Commune, composed of mainly what we would call the sans-culottes, sans-culottes, or those without the three-quarter length pants, the breeches. And no, France was not going about in a state of disrobement. What we are talking about is a distinction of clothing. The common people wore the full-length trousers, and it's only the aristocracy who rode horses or wore breeches or three-quarter length pants, the culottes. And so this is an assembly without the culottes, without the fancy dressed, clothed individuals of the higher-ups. And so it's become customary to equate this assembly with a radical group, with working people, not necessarily your poorest of the poor, but definitely a group of artisans, merchants, classes that have not been represented before in the assemblies. Before the National Convention met, the Paris Commune dominated the political scene, led by newly appointed minister, like the Minister of Justice, Danton, Danton. We're looking at, again, number 12, a continuation of 12 and 13. Thousands of presumed traitors were arrested, then massacred under Danton's decision that the Sans-Culottes needed revenge on the people who were not true revolutionaries. Ordinary traders and artisans could solve the problem, it was argued, rather than the elites. The problems, even though insurmountable, they seemed like overcrowded prisons. Well, one solution was to end the overcrowding of the prisons, just involve the population in mass executions, and that would definitely reduce the number of inmates. September 1792, the newly elected National Convention began its session, the draft of a new constitution. The composition was similar to the predecessors, dominated by lawyers and professionals, property owners. The new element were the artisans. 2/3 of the members were under 45 years of age. Almost all had some political experience because now they've been through a few years of the revolution. They were intensely distrustful of the king. It was no surprise then that the convention's first major step on September 21st, 1792, was to abolish monarchy and establish a republic. The establishment of a republic under 14, that is, again, a revolutionary step and a new history, as it were, to begin for France, was with the declaration of the Republic. Before that, about as far as the members would agree would be that the old regime needed restructuring. How much, what would go, what would stay, it was always up for debate. Right now, the fact that the monarchy was no longer needed was something that all elements within the National Convention agreed. But very soon the National Convention would split apart into two factions over what would happen now to the deposed king. The two most important factions were the Girondins or Girondis and the Montagnards. Both were members of the Jacobin clubs, but the Montagnards, the mountain group, was more radical. They represented the urban citizens. The Girondins, at the risk of sounding too simplistic, were mainly the less radical groups, and they mainly came from the rural areas. While both wanted a republic, the mountain group wanted the demise of the king and the queen. And so they were going to condemn Louis XVI and his wife to death. They actually won by 361 out of 720, so you needed one for the majority. And on June 21st, 1793, as per the decision of the mountain group within the National Convention, the king was executed, and thereafter Marie Antoinette, the queen, and this was a destruction of the old regime. The physical destruction of the old regime was now complete. But the execution, like the civil constitution of the clergy, proved divisive, because now the revolution faced new challenges and new enemies, and almost like 100 years ago in England with the execution of King Charles I, where people on the fence now felt that that was too drastic a step and turned loyalists. Similarly, in France, the deposing of the king and queen seemed acceptable, but the physical demise of the king and queen created a division. Aside from factional disputes between the Girondins and the mountains, there were a lot of local disputes between and amongst communes, stemming from a whole old history of competition and rivalry. Some actually favored radical changes, some of the communes, and some were less radical in their orientation. Um, Between May and June in 1793, the communes organized a demonstration. The Paris Commune actually invaded the National Convention, forced the arrest of the Girondins, and together with the Mountain, they assumed control of the convention. National Convention itself still didn't rule all of France, and the authority of the convention was repudiated in particularly Western France, particularly in the department of the Vendée, Vendee, by peasants who revolted against the new draft. They were all supposed to be a part of the Revolutionary Army. The Vendean revolt was soon escalated into a full-blown counter-revolutionary appeal. Long live the king and our good priests. We want our king, our priests, and the old regime, some of the counter-revolutionaries chanted. And very soon, cities like Lyon and Marseille also joined in, and they broke away from the Paris-controlled system. And again, much of this stemmed from an old commercial economic rivalry with Paris, competition for the number one urban area, the number one trade manufacturing area. So there was a lot of local domestic turmoil that exacerbated the situation within the French Revolution. And this domestic turmoil was paralleled by a foreign crisis. By the beginning of 1793, after Louis XVI was executed, most of Europe was now as a part of an informal coalition because all the monarchs feared for their throne. The assumption was that if it could happen in France, it could happen elsewhere. And so there's a coalition of the Austrian, the Prussian, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British monarchs, even Russia, and the Dutch Republic, which had token royalty involved in the administration, also joined forces, and they were all pitted against the French Revolution and the French Revolutionary Army. Carried away by their initial success and their own rhetoric, France welcomed the struggle, as it called it, but they were grossly overextended. The French armies began to experience reverses by the late spring, and some members of the anti-French coalition were poised for an invasion of France. If successful, both the revolution and revolutionaries would be destroyed, and the old regime could have been re-established. The revolution reached a very divisive and a decisive moment at this point in time. To meet these crises, the program of the National Convention became one of curbing anarchy and counter-revolution at home while attempting to win the war by national mobilization abroad. So as per this dual program that you see in Roman numeral 20, the Committee of Public Safety, dominated initially by Danton, but now taken over by Robespierre, the architect of the Reign of Terror, eventually became one of its most important members. In a 12-month period, 1793 to 94, some 12 members were re-elected, and they were ready to meet all crises. The Committee of Public Safety decreed universal mobilization of the nation in 1793, and in less than a year, the French Revolutionary government raised an army of 650,000. By September 1791, 1,690,000, the largest in European history in any army, pushed allies back across the Rhine, and this was the anti-French coalition that was gradually going to break up by 1795. Historians have focused on the importance of the French Revolutionary Army as an important step in the creation of the modern nation and the whole concept of modern nationalism. Previously, wars had been fought between governments and ruling dynasties by relatively small armies of professional soldiers. The new French army was a creation of a people's government. Its wars were now people's wars. An entire nation was involved in war, and this opened the door to the concept of total war in the modern world of the 20th, 21st century. To meet the domestic crisis, the National Convention and the Committee of Public Safety established the Reign of Terror. Revolutionary courts were instituted to protest the Revolutionary Republic. To protect the Revolutionary Republic from internal enemies, those who by their conduct or their contact, their words, their writings showed themselves to be supporters of tyranny or enemies of liberty, or those who have not constantly manifested their attachment to the revolution. And they were going to be disposed of. The victims of terror now included the Queen, the former revolutionary Girondins, thousands of peasants. Many victims were figures who were opposed to the radical activities, whether they be of the Sans-Culottes or the Jacobin clubs. In the course of 9 months, 16,000 people officially were killed under the blade of the guillotine. True number of victims probably closer to 30,000, but official figures are far lower. The bulk of the terror executions took place in the Vendée, or in cities like Lyon and Marseille, which were in open rebellion and against the authority of the National Convention. So the counter-revolutionaries were deemed as non-revolutionaries or treacherous to the revolution. Military force in the form of revolutionary armies was used to bring recalcitrant cities and districts back under the control of the National Convention. Marseille fell to a revolutionary army in August. Starving Lyon to surrender was the strategy early on in October. And after 2 months of bombardment and resistance, since Lyon was the second city after Paris and was in ardent commercial rivalry with Paris and defied the National Convention during a time when the Republic was in peril, the Committee of Public Safety decided to make an example of it. By April 1794, almost 2,000 citizens of Lyon had been executed. When guillotining proved to be too slow, cannon fire was used to blow condemned men into open graves. A German observer wrote, "Whole ranges of houses, always the most handsome, burnt. Churches, convents, all the dwelling houses of former patricians were in ruins. When I came to the guillotine, the blood of those who had been executed a few hours beforehand was still running in the street. I said to a group of sans-culottes that it would be decent to clear away all the human blood. 'Why should it be cleared?' one of them said to me. 'It's the blood of aristocrats and rebels. The dogs should lick it up.'" In the Vendée, the Revolutionary Army was brutal in putting down the rebel army. Roads were strewn with corpses, committed one commander. Women, priests, monks, children, all have been put to death. I have spared nobody. Most districts in Vendée were equally notorious. Nantes, whose victims were executed by sinking them into barges, in the Loire River, so much so that the Loire River was impassable. All traffic was at a standstill. Contrary to popular opinion, terror demonstrated no class prejudice. Estimates were the nobility, about 8% of the people who were guillotined, middle class, about 25%, and the clergy, 6%, peasants and labor classes, 60% of the victims. To the Committee of Public Safety, this bloodletting was only a temporary expedient. Once the war and domestic emergencies was over, then they would follow with a republic of virtue, as they called it. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen would be fully established. The authority was, although theoretically it was a republic, The French government during the terror was led by a group of 12 men who ordered these executions and justified them as a way to eliminate people who were against the revolution. They were the sole judges, they were the sole decision makers. Other steps to control the French included sending representatives on missions or as agents of the central government to all departments to explain what the war emergency measures amounted to and to implement laws dealing with wartime emergencies. The committee also attempted to provide some economic control. They established a system of requisitions for food and for supplies to cities. Law of the general maximum was established, which established price control on goods deemed essential, ranging from food to drink to fuel and to clothing. The controls didn't work very well, and the government lacked the machinery to enforce them, but bread prices were fixed. National Convention also pursued a policy of dechristianization. The word saint was removed from saint names, and churches and pilgrims and villages were churches were actually closed by the revolutionary armies, and priests were encouraged to marry. In Paris, the Cathedral of Notre Dame was designed, or rather redesigned, and designated as the Temple of Reason in November 1793. A public ceremony dedicated to the worship of reason was held in the former cathedral, in which patriotic maidens, adorned in white dresses, paraded before a temple of reason where the high altar once stood. At the end of the ceremony, a female figure personifying liberty arose out of the temple. As Robespierre came to realize dechristianization was going to backfire, France was still overwhelmingly Catholic. Dechristianization really created more enemies, more of the ambivalence that started with the declaration of the civil constitution of the clergy. December 4, 1793, the Committee of Public Safety sought to centralize administration and exercise greater control to check excesses of the Reign of Terror, campaign against Christianity. In 1794, the committee turned against its radical Parisian supporters, executed leaders of the revolutionary Paris Commune, and turned it into a docile tool. This might have been a good idea for the sake of order, but in suppressing the people who had been its chief supporters, the National Convention alienated an important group. At the same time, France had been successful against foreign forces. The military success meant that there was less need now for the terror. But the terror continued, since Robespierre, who had become a figure of power and authority, became obsessed with purifying the body politic of all corruption. Only then could the Republic of Virtue follow. Many deputies in the National Assembly were fearful, however, that they were not safe while Robespierre was free to act. An anti-Robespierre coalition in the National Convention was now eager to destroy Robespierre before he destroyed them, and so they gathered enough votes to condemn him, and Robespierre himself, ironically, was guillotined on the 27th or the 28th of July, 1794, and that began a reaction which brought an end to the radical stage of the French Revolution. But at what cost? The legacy of violence that was left behind was unthinkable. All right, so radically reordering the structure of daily life, nothing could be more demonstrative of that than the adoption of a new Republican calendar. So on October 5th, 1793, in part because of another attempt to de-Christianize the nation, a calendar would become popular with some of the radical leaders. The years had no longer any relevance to Christ, or so no BC and AD. But from September 22nd, 1792, the day the French Republic was proclaimed, there would be a new beginning. And so at the time the calendar was adopted, France was already living in year 2. The calendar contained 12 months, each month consisting of 3 10-day weeks, thereby eliminating Sunday as a day of rest. The 10th day at the end of each week was a rest day, Day Cardi as it was called. This eliminated Sundays and Sunday worship and Sunday services. France was not going to be ruled or governed by a Christian calendar. No saints' days, no church holidays, no festivals of the Christian tradition were observed. The latter was to be replaced by revolutionary festivals. Especially important was the 5 days, 6 in the leap year, which were left over in the calendar at the end of the year. These days were to form like a half a week of festivals to celebrate revolutionary virtues like intelligence and virtue and labor and rewards. But mainly they were celebrating liberty, equality, and fraternity or nationalism. A 6th extra day in the leap year would be a special festival day when Frenchmen would come from all parts of the Republic to celebrate liberty and equality, to cement by their embraces the national fraternity. Of course, ending church holidays also reduced the number of non-working days from 56 to 32, a goal long recommended by 18th century economic theoreticians. So in addition to its own anti-Christian function, the revolutionary calendar also served as commemoration of the revolution as a new historical beginning, a discontinuity with the past, and an economic solution. After the death of Robespierre on July 28, 1794, a reaction set in, namely the Thermidorian reaction. Thermidor were the months of heat, just as Fructidor were the months of spring. And in the new calendar, 2 months were grouped together to depict a season. Fructidor, fruition, spring, things come to bloom. Thermidor, heat. And so the months of Thermidor. Terror came to a halt during the Thermidorian reaction. The National Convention received the power of the committee, reduced the power of the Committee on Public Safety, closed the Jacobin clubs, and made attempts to provide better protection for the National Convention against Parisian mobs. Churches were allowed to reopen for public worship, and a decree on February 21st, 1795 gave freedom of worship to all cultures, to all churches. Economic regulations were dropped in favor of the laissez-faire philosophy, leave the wall alone, capitalism. Another clear indication that moderate forces were gaining control of the revolution. So now we're entering the second moderate phase, which is under C, right below Latin numeral 22, or 23, I'm sorry. To avoid the dangers of a single legislative assembly body, the Constitution of 1795 established a National Legislative Assembly consisting of 2 chambers, a lower house, namely the Council of 500, whose function was to initiate legislation, and an upper house of 250 members, consisting of a Council of Elders composed of married or widowed members over 40 who accepted or rejected proposed laws. 750 members of the legislature chosen by electors who were propertied electors chosen by citizens who were male, and taxpayers over 21. The Council of Elders elected a 5-member executive from the list presented by the Council of 500 as a directory. This executive authority body was going to be instrumental in bringing Napoleon to power. The insurrection in Paris, which was the composition of the two-thirds of the old assembly, dismissed after fierce combat by an army contingent under the artillery general Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte, the last time the city of Paris was to impose its wishes on the central government, that was a time that Bonaparte was going to initiate an attempt to take over power. He had ingratiated himself with the Directory, the 5-member executive committee, which could be accused of every corruption. The government was surrounded with political enemies. The executive, in particular, the Directory members, were steeped in corruption, speculation, gambling, elaborate schemes that they were involving themselves in with the nobility. It was attacked from the far left, from the far right. Royalists who desired a restoration of the monarchy violently opposed them. Jacobins hoped for the economic collapse of France and the complete restructuring of a political takeover. Some radicals went beyond the earlier goals, like, for example, expressed in Babeuf's What Was the French Revolution? An open war between patricians and plebeians, between the rich and the poor, and Babeuf wanted to abolish private property altogether, eliminate private enterprise, but that conspiracy was crushed and he was executed in 1797. New elections took place again in 1797, more uncertainty and instability, battered by both the left and the right, unable to find a definitive solution to the country's economic problems, still carrying on wars. The Committee of Public Safety was left somewhat stranded and friendless, and eventually the Directory came to rely more and more on the military to maintain its rather tenuous position. And in the military were adventurous and ambitious individuals like Napoleon. Ultimately, this led to a coup in 1799, in which a successful and popular general, Napoleon, was able to seize power and put eventually the crown of France on his own head and create a revolution all his own. The military coup by Napoleon, launched in 1799, would eventually lead to the declaration of himself as the Emperor of the French in a few years, and how that would happen and whether or not this had anything to do with the French Revolution, of which he himself would consider himself a product, but whether you would or not is a different issue altogether.